1, 2, 3, 4. I told you so. I told you. I told you so. I told you. Remember when I told you about 9/11? Remember when I told you about Building 7? Remember when I told you about the fluoride in the water? Yes, I did. Remember when I told you about the New World Order? Remember that? Remember when I told you about the chemtrails in the sky? Remember when I told you that NASA was full of lies? Remember when I told you about the ultra mind control? Well, I just want to say that I told you so, yeah.
Hello, this is Kenny Williamson, and welcome back to another episode of McKill's Deck Chronicles. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about the White Alice communication system. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the White Alice communication system, but it's a pretty interesting little thing, and I have a theory on that system and how it worked. Now, you can obviously get the information online on how this system supposedly worked, but I'll tell you my opinion on that here in just a minute. So to get started on this, let's go over a couple of the basics on this thing. So the White Alice communication system was a United States Air Force telecommunication network that had 80 radio stations. Now, these radio stations were constructed in Alaska during the Cold War. And what they tell you is it used something called tropospheric scatter for over-the-horizon communication. Okay? So basically what these things are large parabolic discs, which look like giant satellite discs, and they called them antennas, of course. So what these things looked like is a giant satellite dish. And when I say giant, I'm talking like, 4 or 5 stories tall, 100 feet wide. These things are enormous. And they had 80 of these locations in Alaska. So if you take a look at some of the pictures of these things, you will find that they look an awful lot like a gigantic modern-day satellite dish. But these things were installed in the early 50s. Okay, so this was before the so-called NASA came out with, space flight, and then many years before so-called satellites in outer space. So these systems connected remote Air Force sites in Alaska, and they used it for communication and early warning communication, for what they called the DEW line, which is a distant early warning line for if somebody was to fly over Alaska to try to attack the United States. They called that the DEW line. Okay, these particular facilities were also used for civilian phone calls. And according to the documentation, this system was very advanced for its time, but it became obsolete within 20 years following the advent of satellite communications. So what we have is some funny-looking dishes that transmit and receive over long distances, and they look like a satellite dish, but they're not using satellites in outer space, as they claim, because they didn't exist. So they were definitely some pretty good technology considering we didn't have satellites, right? I mean, they are supposedly bouncing signals off of what's called the troposphere, which is the lowest, setting of air or whatever we have in the atmosphere layers, they claim. The troposphere is the bottom one, where like airplanes fly and birds fly. Now, supposedly, this system shot a signal up into the air, and it basically bounced off nothing. It bounced off of air. And so it bounced off of nothing and came back down and hit a receiver. So I personally don't understand how you can bounce a satellite signal, a radio signal off of nothing. But as you are well aware of, these are the same people that claim the Big Bang happened. And of course the Big Bang went, we had nothing and it exploded into something. So these same so-called scientists believe that we came from nothing, absolutely nothing, exploded into something, exploded into everything. So it doesn't really seem that far-fetched to me for them to say, oh, by the way, we're bouncing a signal off of nothing. But it works, and it works great. In fact, this White Alice system was in business for a minimum of 20 years. Okay, and according to the information, it was conceived in the early 1950s, and basically Alaska at that time only had basic telephone communication systems. And they were saying that prior to White Alice being installed, you could only place one phone call at a time from Nome, Alaska to Fairbanks, Alaska. And this communication supposedly improved after White Alice was installed. Okay, but it claims that even in the mid-60s over there in Alaska, that if you were in Anchorage, Alaska, you had to go to one location downtown to place a phone call to the lower 48 states. So, they don't have a lot of, obviously back then, up into the 60s, they didn't, makes you wonder how they did this. In Alaska, you can create one phone call at a time, and you have to go into town to do it in the 60s. But, like in 1969, they claimed that the President of the United States made a phone call to the moon. Okay? With the moon landing, they claim that, they landed on the moon, and the President called the moon from the Oval Office on a telephone, a landline, in 1969. Now, in the 60s, there was only one phone call at a time being done in Alaska, and that's on the ground. That's on the earth. And, they've got this system installed, and we're still only getting one phone call at a time. To me, that's, I don't know. I don't know how you could say you're doing that, but yet you can make a phone call to the moon. But anyway, I digress on that. So, back to White Alice. So the Air Force is who built the White Alice communication system, with also numerous support facilities around the state of Alaska. And let's see, construction on White Alice began in 1955, and the system was dedicated in 1958. And I want to make a note of that, of 1958, because it just so happens in 1958 was also when NASA came online. Okay, 1958 is also when the first stories of the Bermuda Triangle came out that started telling people that Bermuda Triangle was a dangerous place, and there had been, lots of planes and ships missing in that area. So basically stay away from it. So as I put out in my book, The Flat Earth Bible, I make note of that as well, that there's a lot of strange things kind of start happening all together in 1958. So in the end of the 50s was a crazy time for this whole thing to happen. We have this White Alice communication system get dedicated, I guess come fully online in somewhere in there, which they start communicating long distances, but not via satellite, mind you. Not via satellite, not yet. And NASA comes on board, and then Bermuda Triangle comes on board. And if you know anything about, the flat Earth thing, it's pretty obvious that NASA is shooting its rockets out to Bermuda. Okay, there's only one island out there, Bermuda Island, and they control it. And anyway, so they're shooting the rockets out to Bermuda. That's what I believe. So when they came online, they had to fabricate a giant story to keep people away from that area, because that's where they're shooting the rockets. They're not going to outer space. They're going right into the ocean over there in Bermuda. But anyway, back to White Alice here. So this thing comes online and gets dedicated in 1958 in Alaska. This thing was designed by Western Electric, and it says that civilian contractors actually maintained it. And in 1976, this White Alice communication was leased to RCA. And by the end of the 1970s, most of the system was deactivated. Now, most does not mean all, okay? So in other words, this thing was probably running up into the 80s. So think about that for a minute. This thing must be working pretty good for it to be used all that time, and they're not about to get rid of it. So the reason it seems that it was called White Alice to begin with is that back in those days, in the 50s, the Air Force used two-word code names, and White Alice was the code name selected for this particular project. They think that it's fairly certain that White Alice was used to indicate the snowy, or the word white, not White Alice, but white was used to indicate the snowy Arctic sites that the system worked on there in Alaska. And they are unclear where Alice, the name Alice, originated. So, they really don't know, I guess, on that. But so this system was named White Alice. So that's where they got the name. Now, this system was built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and Alaska had surveyed and selected each one of the original sites. And let's see, the selection process to find these sites basically had survey teams test the area and the propagation path. So by setting up communication towers at each remote site during the winter months and basically testing how much, I guess, receiving, transmitting, and receiving they could get from each location. So they set something up to do these tests prior to building these humongous sites. Now again, these things are supposedly bouncing signals off of the air, okay, off of nothing. So, I don't know how they could guarantee any signal like that, but supposedly they did. And of course, they're saying that the construction of these things were very expensive, even in those days. The first phase cost over $110 million, which in the 50s is a lot of money. Then they're saying that overall, this project cost $300 million. So that's a whole lot of money in the 50s. Okay, when you could buy a brand new car in the 50s for $2,000 or $3,000 fully loaded, and this thing's costing $300 million in the 50s. That's a lot of money. But anyway, so come to find out, it took 20 people to run one of these locations, and 180 kilowatt generator. So that's a 180,000 watt generator. A diesel generator was having to run at each location to keep these things running. And that's 80 locations. So, they're using lots and lots of diesel to keep these things running for over 20 years. So that's so much for your global warming. When it comes to the military or something, they could absolutely care less. They can run a diesel engine, all day long, 80 of them out there for 20 years, full blast, and doesn't make any difference. Just like they can, charge all of their electric vehicles now with big diesel generators and claim they're doing something good because they're driving an electric vehicle around. Getting charged by an 18-wheeler size diesel generator that's burning up, tens of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel. Can you imagine how much diesel fuel these White Alice sites burned over 20 years? Can you imagine? Probably millions of gallons of diesel. But that's how they ran these things because, there's no electricity out there. They're out on remote locations in Alaska. So, anyway, basically, what they're claiming is that these things shot out, so many megahertz, a signal, and it basically, one dish is aimed and it would shoot up, and it's basically up towards the sky, but not like straight up, but kind of at a small angle. And wherever that thing would hit up on the troposphere, say, it would reflect back down to another location. And that location was constant. So once they figured out exactly where it was going to come back down, they could build another station that receives the signal, point it up in the same direction, and lo and behold, you've got communication. Now, they claim that this was, before satellite communication, and that satellites actually made this thing become obsolete. Because, why would you need, this is their logic, why would you need these giant things running when we could do this with a satellite in outer space? Of course, that doesn't make any sense to me because if you're reflecting these waves, these transmissions, this satellite, whatever you're doing here, these radio waves, you're reflecting them off the troposphere. Okay, that's what you're claiming, and you're calling it tropospheric scattering. And it works great. And as your technology goes along, you can put more information in these signals. And the dish gets smaller and smaller and smaller. You don't need a dish the size of a building. You can do it with a dish the size of a car. And then as technology gets a little further, you can do it with a dish, the size of an umbrella. And put more information. Everything has got more and more and more, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. But in order for this to work, according to what we have today, is you have to have an actual satellite floating around in outer space. Now, if you believe that, I personally don't, but, in order for you to believe that, you have to believe that they shot a satellite up into outer space, and it is geocentrically locked to the Earth. So in other words, they shoot it up into one place, and it develops an orbit around the Earth, and it has to maintain that orbit with fuel. Supposedly, there's fuel on board of these satellites, and that's what keeps them in their orbit. Okay? So what I did is I did a little bit of research, for example, on Dish Network. Because Dish Network, obviously people have these dishes on their house. And what's happening here, according to Dish Network, is they claim that they have 14 satellites in outer space. 14. And what they have is they have a giant place, and I can't remember exactly where it's at. I'd have to look it up again. An uplink area. That's right. It's in Cheyenne, Wyoming. They have a giant uplink center in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And this thing consists of, let's say, 20, 30 satellite dishes. And they're all aimed up at different areas. You can look at the picture yourself and Google it. So these dishes are supposedly pointing at 14 satellites orbiting the Earth. Now, the Dish Network has millions of customers. So if you take, and I don't know how many million, but let's say you had 10 million customers, but you only have let's make this easy math. Let's say you have 14 million customers and you have 14 satellites. That means each satellite is running 1 million customers. So this satellite in outer space, supposedly about the size of a car, it is in outer space in geocentric orbit. It has fuel on board that keeps it in that orbit. Okay? And I'm assuming they're claiming it gets, its power to be able to accept a satellite transmission and beam it back down to 1 million people. It has to have electricity to do that, right? It has to have some form of power. So I'm sure they're claiming they're getting the power from the solar panels. Okay, so we've got solar panels in outer space on a box floating around in outer space, and this box is accepting an uplink from Dish Network, and then it is downloading it to your dish on your house. So you're receiving it. Okay, that's what they're claiming. Now, we were doing this same thing before off of the air and didn't need a satellite, but now all of a sudden we need a satellite. Okay, now I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to help you to understand something. I don't believe there are satellites in outer space, and I don't believe that the White Alice system was working off of nothing. I believe that there's a firmament above the earth exactly as the Bible describes. Okay, that firmament is described in Job as a hard, molten looking glass. So I think that this firmament has a reflective value, kind of like a mirror, if you will. Okay, it can reflect because it's like a glass, hard type surface, or reflective in the very least. I think that the government figured out many, many years ago that you can aim a signal at the firmament, and depending on where it hits, depends on where it comes back down. Okay? So it's not like a regular radio wave that's just in the air that anybody can pick up. This is actually being reflected back down, and you have to know where to look to pick it up. Okay? So in my opinion, this is why if you were to get Dish Network or DirecTV or anything else, the guy comes out and he sees where your house is, wherever you live, and he says, oh, well, our satellite in outer space, it's over here at 61.5 degrees west, and it's named EchoStar. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to aim your dish a certain level degrees high, and at 61.5, and I've got a little meter here, and that meter tells him how powerful the signal is being intercepted. And so, I don't know if it's 80%, 100%. I don't know what their cutoff level is there before they'll accept it. And sometimes they'll say, but we've also got another one over here at 72.7 degrees west. And so he'll aim it over there, and he'll check on his little meter, and he'll be like, oh, okay, well, guess what? This is the better location. You get a better signal aimed here. So what I think is happening is you have Dish Network over there in Wyoming. They have a dish aimed up at a point on the firmament. Where it comes back down is 61.5 degrees west. They have another dish aimed up at the firmament. Where it comes down is 72.7 degrees west. They're sending a signal up at both satellites at the same time. They're hitting the firmament and being reflected back down. You take your dish and you aim it at that one spot, and depending on your location and whatever the other contributing factors are, which I don't know, you're going to get a better signal. And so then the guy says, oh, well, you're getting a better signal here on our EchoStar 5 instead of EchoStar 10. And he continues to put your dish in that area. He screws it all down and tightens all the nuts and bolts. And he has this little meter. He makes sure it's right. And then they plug it into your receiver. And voila, you have Dish Network. You have Dish Satellite TV. Okay? Now, the technician who is at your house, I'm assuming 99.9% of them, they have no idea. They're not in on anything, okay? Because I can hear somebody saying it now, saying, you mean to tell me that Dish Network guy, he's in on all this? That's ridiculous. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying he's just like me or you or anybody else. He was taught that there are satellites in outer space, and he believes it. And when he points his little dish up at the air, he thinks he's pointing it to a satellite that is in the exosphere 6,000 miles away. That's what he believes. And he believes the signal is coming back down from outer space. That's what he thinks. And all he's looking for is the best signal. He sets it up, he's gone. Okay? So that's how this thing works, in my opinion. They claim that this point they're aiming at is a satellite. Okay, well, think about that for a second. They're claiming that these satellites they have, this is Dish. I mean, other places may be different, but this is the research that I did on Dish Network alone, okay? Dish Network claims that their satellites typically last from 15 to 20 years, okay? Now, that lifespan depends on a few different factors. For example, fuel supply, its orbital position, according to them, and then wear and tear. So, we've got wear and tear up in outer space, okay? Think about this for a second. The thing that interests me the most here is fuel supply. According to what they have to say, regarding to fuel supply here, satellites use onboard fuel for station keeping. And what that means is maintaining their position in orbit. They have fuel. Now, these things must be very fuel efficient if they can sit up there for 20 years and only use the fuel that's on board, because these things aren't very big, so they don't have a very big fuel tank, obviously. Okay? And once the fuel runs out, the satellite can no longer adjust its position. Okay? So that's one of the things that, a factor in the lifespan of these satellites. Another thing is solar panel degradation. So basically, as you would assume, over time, exposure to solar radiation reduces the efficiency of a solar panel, which powers the satellite as far as sending and receiving. Okay. And we've also got electronics wear and tear, because the satellite's internal systems, they can tear up and degrade due to prolonged exposure to space radiation and extreme temperature. I want you to take a note of that extreme temperature, okay? And then, of course, it could also run into something. It could collide with something that's also orbiting, debris that's orbiting. And if it collides with this, of course, it can damage the satellite. Okay. So now this is an interesting thing here regarding the fuel that we talked about on a satellite. Okay. So here's what Dish says they do with their satellites. Okay. If the satellite is still working good, so in other words, it still functions, it's still transmitting and receiving, but it runs out of fuel. Okay. So if it runs out of fuel, it can no longer, maintain its orbit. It says that they move it to what's called a graveyard orbit. So the thing has run out of fuel, or I guess maybe proactively it's almost out of fuel. So they say, oh, we need to move it. So they move it to a graveyard orbit that's 300 kilometers above its normal geostationary orbit. Okay. So how it can stay in that orbit, I don't know, because it's out of fuel. It can't stay in its other orbit, so they move it to a different orbit. So in other words, it never comes down. So you never get to see it. If you can picture this, okay? So, of course, then it says if it's no longer functional, it may still remain in the geostationary position until gravity slowly alters its orbit. So in some cases, they may try to come down, but they burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. So, that's what they teach. That's what they claim. That's what they teach. I personally don't believe it. And I tell you one of the reasons that makes this thing so hard to believe is they claim that these satellites are up in the exosphere. Okay? The exosphere is between, I don't know, I thought what it was is a couple thousand kilometers all the way to 10,000 kilometers. That's where they're at. And that is basically 6,000 miles above Earth. Okay, they're claiming that in that area where the satellites are at, you have an average temperature on the high side of 2,500 degrees Celsius, which is 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so this satellite is flying in an area for 15 to 20 years that's almost, okay, it says 4,532. That's the high side. But let's, just to be very generous here, okay, very generous, let's pull that back down to, how about 3,000? Or I tell you what, let's be super nice and say, you know what, it's up to 4,532 Fahrenheit, but let's say it just so happens this satellite got into a really good area of outer space and it's only 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's all. Just 2,500 degrees. Because it could be 4,500, but we're going to say 2,500, to give everybody a nice fair benefit of the doubt, right? So we have our satellite in 2,500 degrees. And like they said, they could have solar panel degradation. Really? You think? What are the solar panels made out of? I mean, the framework that holds this thing out is probably made out of aluminum, right? Titanium? Magnesium? I mean, what else could it be? It has to be lightweight or they'll never get this thing off the ground and get it in outer space. But, aluminum melts at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, it's in 2,500 degrees. So if it was made of aluminum, it would turn into liquid. Titanium melts at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So, maybe titanium in some areas, but then again, this is actually goes up to 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. So it gets an additional 1,500 degrees above the melting point of titanium. And that's titanium. Did I say magnesium? Well, it's titanium. Titanium is steel. It's pretty tough stuff. So if it was made out of titanium, it could handle up to 3,000 degrees. But we know that a solar panel is not made out of titanium. It's made out of all different stuff, but it's got composite on it. That stuff melts at a pretty low temperature. We have gold. They claim that the electronics in lots of these satellites are made out of gold. They're gold plated because that helps with heat and it helps with some kind of interference. Well, gold melts at 1,948 degrees Fahrenheit. So it couldn't last in 2,500 degrees. So, of course, lead, there's probably no lead in it. Lead's too heavy, but it melts at 621 degrees. Because I've read before that they would have to have like so many inches of lead in some of this stuff to protect the stuff from radiation. Well, lead is very heavy and it melts at a very low temperature. So lead is not going to make it very long. It's going to literally melt and run out into outer space. And of course, magnesium, it melts at 1,200 degrees, about like aluminum. And so you're like, well, maybe they put some steel up there. Maybe this satellite's made out of steel. Well, Steel varies, but right around 1,300 degrees, it starts melting, depending on the steel. Okay, obviously, stainless steel is better, but steel is very heavy. So we have satellites in outer space that are circling around in the exosphere 6,000 miles away. These satellites are about the size of an automobile, and they actually claim that you can look up in the air at certain times at night and see a satellite fly by. 6,000 miles away, the size of a car. Now, if you think about this for a second, you understand that if you look up at a jet airplane flying over, like a 747, okay, they're only flying at like 30 to 40,000 feet, which is, let's say, 7 miles high. Okay, roughly 7 miles off the ground, if they're even that. So 30-some thousand feet, and you can see a 747, which is a very big machine compared to a satellite. And, you know, it looks like a speck in the sky, just a dot. And if it's lower, you can make it out pretty good. But majority of the time, you can just see a little bitty dot flying across the sky, depending on its altitude. And that's a 747. Okay? So they're claiming that these satellites, which are, again, the size of a car, you can see them, and they're 6,000 miles away. Not 6,000 feet, 6,000 miles. So if you, like I said, if you really stop and think about the stuff that they're telling you, if you have this other information, I think you're probably going to come to the conclusion that somebody's lying, okay, about something. So it makes you wonder, you know, we know they can do the same kind of communication. It works in the same way, and that's what they did with the White Alice communication system before satellites. These things look like satellite dishes, okay? Now, let's jump forward to current, 2025. I Googled it, and I found several pictures of the same technology being used today, and I have pictures of it, but obviously you can't see it on here. The military still uses it, and they call it tropospheric scatter machine, and it's nothing more than a couple of small satellite dishes attached to some military vehicle, and they claim they are doing the same thing as they did with White Alice. They're just doing it out in the desert, or they're doing it wherever, because it still works just fine. And literally, it's a satellite dish. But this one's not a satellite. This is tropospheric scattering. So we're bouncing this signal off nothing instead of a satellite in outer space. My question is why? I mean, if you've supposedly got satellites, like there's supposedly thousands of them up there now, thousands and thousands of these satellites, and the military probably owns a high majority of them, or leasing them, or whatever they're doing, supposedly, why would you bother bouncing satellite signals or any kind of signal off of nothing? You know, off of the air. Why don't you just go ahead and shoot it up to the satellite and shoot it back down? For some reason, they don't do that. I personally don't know why they don't just claim they're doing it. I don't understand that. Maybe a military person can explain that to me. Why bother with tropospheric scattering that supposedly the stuff is obsolete from the 50s, but we're still using it today? But we also supposedly have satellites in outer space, which caused the tropospheric scattering to go obsolete. Okay? Maybe, just maybe, there are no such thing as satellites in outer space. Okay? And all of these people are bouncing signals off of the firmament, and they always have been. Okay? So if that's true, everything they tell you about moon landing, Mars landings, International Space Station is all fake. So the only reason, in my mind, other than the devil trying to mislead you in every way that he can, other than that, the only reason they would be doing this is for money. Because you can think about this as a giant money laundering system, you know. And let's go with NASA first. So NASA's huge. Their budgets, you know, depending on where you read, depends on the number you find. But it's anywhere from $65 million to $75 million a day is their budget. So they have all these people working for them and, you know, that are getting rich, multimillionaires. They're not supposed to be getting rich, but somehow all these people, you know, we've all seen this on the news recently, all these people are getting kickbacks and getting paid millions of dollars for doing nothing. Okay? So we know that's happening there too. And so, but they claim the money's going to this very expensive space travel. So most people don't see any of this space travel. All they get are videos and CGI pictures of, you know, planets out in outer space, you know, fake space stations with astronauts hanging on wires, all kinds of glitches that can't happen in outer space, bubbles in outer space. It's clearly being filmed in a pool. The list goes on and on and on. So in other words, they're taking that money and it's not being spent on what they claim. They claim they have all these very big expenses, but if they didn't have those expenses and everything you got was fake and CGI, your actual spending, you know, your output would be very little. So you've got a huge incoming tax, you know, incoming money from taxes, but your outgoing's very little because you don't really do any of the stuff you say. You just pretend you do it. And instead you get to keep the money and you get to be a multimillionaire, you know, and live like a king. That's one thought. So picture a business though, like Dish Network. And I'm not saying they're doing this, I don't know. But picture if you had this business and now the government can't get onto you. The IRS can't stop you because the government wants you to believe in satellites. So they have to claim there are satellites. So they can't argue and say, no, there's not, you're lying. They have to go along. So that's perfect for your business, see? All you have to say is, look, I've got a really big expense here. I've got 14 satellites in outer space. Do you know how much those things cost me? Oh, billions. So I need big tax write-offs because I've got all this money going to satellites in outer space. Now you can't see them. You can't touch them. Nothing. But they're there, supposedly. And I can prove to you it's there. I'm going to send a signal up and it's going to come back down. See, there's all my proof. That's all the proof I need. So that sounds like a pretty good business model if you want to rip people off. You know, you can basically send your signal up, bounce it back down to satellite dishes off of the firmament, and, you know, charge your customer, which of course they are supplying the dish and the equipment. And, it's where it's not where just anybody can intercept it. It's encrypted. And that's what I'm trying to say. So that the data is encrypted. So, you have to have programmers that can encrypt and know what to do. And you have to have your machine that sends it. You have to have your Dish Network box and everything that receives it. So there is money involved. Yes, lots of money. But, then if you say, oh, but by the way, this year we had another satellite go down and that cost us another $100 million. So you've got some really, really good tax write-offs. So if a person wanted to, rip the government off as far as taxes and make tons of money and claim it's being spent when it's really padding somebody's pocket, hey, claim you've got a satellite in outer space, especially, if you're bouncing it off of the firmament. The firmament's free. It's just sitting up there. So, in my opinion, that's why, other than complete satanic, being deceived by Satan, other than that, I think that sounds like a really good reason why somebody would want to get on board with this. Hey, get on board with this and let's claim we need a satellite. And nobody can get onto us and nobody can call us out because all these upper people, all the government, are claiming satellites exist. So they can't call you a liar. Now, are they going to put their claws into your business? I think so. That's what I believe. Because, let's go back to Dish again. According to what I read about this Dish Network deal, on this huge satellite uplink that they have, the government is doing some stuff with them on that and supposedly is giving them huge grants, like $6 million, $60 million. I mean, just huge amounts of money the government is putting in this stuff for some reason. So what I think is the government has their hand in all of this. And so they make sure they get their hand out by making sure this company makes money and gets lots of IRS tax breaks for all the money it's spending. And then the government has to come in and subsidize. And the government also gives them large amounts of money. Why? I don't know. Why the government would need to give, something to do with, TV. Why the government has to give them grants, I don't understand. Unless they're padding people's pockets. So you've got the big owner of Dish Network or whoever is in charge. They actually know the truth. They're accepting the money. They're giving kickbacks to the government, or these are government officials, and they keep this whole big charade going. Now, yes, you do get your TV. I mean, they really are sending up signals to the firmament, and they really are bouncing back down to your TV. And they can do that with satellite, satellite internet, satellite TV. They can do that with satellite audio, like the satellite in your car that picks up, Sirius satellite. They can do that with anything. Any kind of information can be bounced off the firmament at any time. And you have to be underneath of it to receive it. Okay? They're doing it. But I don't believe that a satellite's in outer space. And I believe that this White Alice system that was in place for over 20 years called tropospheric scattering, that the government, the military, is supposedly still using it to this very day. I believe that proves that they don't need satellites in outer space to get this job done. Okay? They're doing it without the satellites. They were doing it before the satellites. And I don't think there are any satellites. I think that it's a hoax. It's a giant money laundering hoax. That's what I think it is. Now, that is my humble opinion. Okay? I am obviously no expert on any of that stuff, but I believe that it's fake. Now, obviously you can believe whatever you want, but I believe it's fake. So anyway, I think that's all I had to cover. So I hope on this podcast that you have a grasp of knowledge now. You can grasp what White Alice is, what it was, what it's doing, how it worked, and how I believe it proves there's no need for a satellite, and that's how we're doing the stuff we're doing today. Now, also, NASA has hot air balloons. They have lots of hot air balloons. NASA is one of the largest purchasers of helium in the world. And so there are lots of balloons flying around that are doing some of this stuff. Now, obviously, like Dish Network and other dish places, you take your dish at your house, it's pointed up, it stays in the same place for 10 years. So obviously that's not a balloon because these balloons are moving around. But as far as doing other things like taking pictures of Earth, like Google Earth, they're not using a satellite. and they're probably not using the Firmament. I believe they are using a helium balloon type satellite, and they're also using drones. Okay, they're using airplanes that fly back and forth to get this stuff done, and they're using satellite type balloons. But they're not using satellites in outer space. There's no such thing. For example, Google Earth, they do all your routes and all your houses and how you get the street view. The Google machines, the cars are driving around all the time. I've seen hundreds of them in different areas. They've got cameras all over them, and these people just drive these cars all over the place. They drive down every street, every road, and it films everything. And that's where they're getting their pictures. They're not getting these road pictures and, ground level pictures from a satellite in outer space. They're getting it from a Chevrolet car driving up and down the roads, and you can see that for yourself. And you can do a simple Google search, and you can see the Google drones they're using with cameras all over them to take pictures of your house. And they're probably using balloons as well, satellite balloons. But they're not using satellites in outer space. Okay? That's my belief. I think it's verifiable. If you want to know more information on that kind of stuff, I have videos, quite a few videos on my website, and putting on more all the time on itsflatbro.com. You go check that out. There's a lot of videos on there. On the bottom of the page, there's a place to contact me if you want to. And also on the bottom of the page is a link to Patreon, YouTube, and X. And I have this same podcast only in a video form that I posted on YouTube. Like I said, on X, well, there's a link on X. On YouTube, TikTok, Patreon, and Rumble. And I actually show you the pictures of everything that I'm talking about. Now, it is going to be a 2-part series because it's taking a little longer because I've got pictures. And I am saying a few things different because this is a audio only, and the other, and it's recorded on a different platform, but it's basically the same information. So if you want to see the pictures and stuff, go to itsflatbro.com or truthseekersministry.org, and you can follow the links at the bottom of the website, and it will take you to these same videos. Okay? If you like what you hear and you want to donate something, you can go on to Patreon and donate if you want. But as always, this stuff is always 100% for free. So, anyway, having said all that, I hope that this helped you. I hope that, some of this stuff, it is not, well, I say it's not Bible related. I believe that it's biblical cosmology. But this stuff is not salvation issue. Okay, you don't have to, it doesn't matter if you believe in satellites in outer space or you believe in balloons. It really doesn't make any difference as far as your salvation is concerned. You can still be saved, you can still believe in Jesus Christ and all the above without believing anything about flat earth, without believing anything about satellites and NASA. Some people could care less. I think it's very interesting. I think it has to do with discernment. And, I think that if they can fool you on all these different levels, they can just about tell you anything. So this is something to think about. So if you're interested, you want to know more, give me an email. My email address is truthseekers2012@gmail.com. Again, check out the website. You can get in contact me on any one of those. And you can check out the Flat Earth Bible, the book I have for sale. There's a link. It's on Amazon, but it's on the website as well. So thanks for listening. If you have any comments, questions, anything like that, give me an email. Thanks again, and God bless you.
Remember when I told you about the vaccine agenda? Yes, I did. And that Michelle Obama is a transgender. Yes, he is. The dinosaur fraud, the climate change scam, and yes, Sandra Bullock is also a man. Remember when I told you that there ain't no clue? Well, I just want to say that I told you so. I told you so. I told you so.